what I'm going to do here now, to sort of break things up a little bit, is that we're going to introduce a poll. So this is now the impact. The impact is on the audience. So those of you, I see we've still got about 90 folks still here. So I'll just check I've had a message. And we're going to have an audience participation poll. And what that is using Mentimeter, and there's going to be a slide, I think, that's going to go up in a minute. I'm hoping one of the people in the back room is going to put up menti.com. Mentimeter. Can I just check that that's going up? Anyway, that should come up in a minute. Here it is. And so the question that's going to you all in the audience, and obviously panelists and what have you can answer as well, is where should the development of incentives for forest ecosystem services provision concentrate? So we've had loads of things from different panelists this morning exploring this issue. So for you in the audience hearing all of that, where should the development of incentives concentrate? And we're asking you to put them in order. So ignore the order that's down on there. That's just an example, the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. We would like audience members to put up in what order the development of incentives for forest ecosystem provision should concentrate. Okay. So you're going to be able to do that during the next session and during the coffee break. And during the next coffee break, we'll put the slide up again in case you haven't copied everything down. So capture it now, get your phones out. It's menti.com and the code is 21092259. Okay, to participate in the poll. It'd be great to hear what you've all got to think about that. Okay, so we're now on to the next session. It's 4 o'clock. So we've just done some discussions about the provision of forest ecosystem services and the markets. We're now getting into the policy section. And so we're going back to Georg here, Georg Winkel, who is head of the Bonn office and head of governance program at FE, and Helga Pützel, who's the assistant director for policy support at FE as well. And they're going to talk about the politics of forest ecosystem services in Europe, conflicting views, policies, and changing societal perceptions. So Georg, hopefully your slides are all working fine now. And so I will hand over to you.
Hello.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Georg.
You always get a second chance. I hope you can now really see the slides of the presentation.
Yes, that's all working fine.
2 hours to train, and I hope it works now. Nice that you're still on board. And it's an intense afternoon, and it will continue to be a bit intense. I'm happy to start a joint presentation together with my colleague Helga Pützel, via we both presenting. Because Helga presents actually the NOBEL project. When we decided to do this as a joint presentation, she was still at the university in Vienna, and I'm coming in from the Cincy side. And the topic we choose is the politics of forest ecosystems in Europe, changing societal perceptions and conflicting policy views. We have 3 questions that we would like to touch upon. The first one is, which ecosystem services do European citizens actually demand? Secondly, what is the importance of policy for forest ecosystem services provision innovations? And lastly, our big joint slide that had involved a lot of discussions amongst the 2 of us. What can be concluded for EU forest policy making? Over to Helga.
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure whether you can hear me.
Yes, you're coming through fine, Helga.
But it's Sven on the picture. Okay. Nonetheless, I will start. I have a little longer hair than Sven. Okay. So the question is, which ecosystem services do European citizens demand? And we have asked these questions with citizens in Austria, Catalonia, Germany, Russia, and also Sweden. And what we found is that the highest preference for clean air, water, preservation of plants and animals, and mitigation of climate change was very clear among the respondents. But we found also that wood and fuel production and employment, forest as a source of employment, found lower support. But this is just the overall picture. We would like to, not sure what is Geshe not trying to tell me. Ah, okay, good. What I see is something different what you see. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware. Okay, Georg, let's go to the next picture and dive a little bit more into the data. So zooming in, of course, it is interesting to hear what the respondents actually think about the importance of forests. And interestingly, we found that our respondents from Austria and Russia, they found forests significantly more important than in Catalonia and Sweden, but in their close surrounding, wider surrounding country, but all perceived forest in the country and the region most important. From a gender perspective, I think this is also very important because female respondents perceive forests significantly more important than male. And from an age perspective, I think that is very interesting because respondents between the 45 and 54 years perceive the importance of forest in the wider surrounding in the country more important. But overall, we can say that actually with the increase of age, also the importance of forests that respondents give to it increases. And I think especially the gender perspective and the age perspective is significant when we want to communicate about forests. Next slide, please. So to sum up, clean air and water, preservation of plants and animals, the mitigation of climate change, but also beauty is found most important for all respondents. And age and the respondents' relationship to forest showed as the strongest predictor, especially for wood production, fuel production, source of employment. While the socioeconomic factors where the person comes from, education and gender are important for the type of forest ecosystem services that is prioritized, we should also look at values and environmental values that citizens hold. And then the picture shows a little different. So next slide, please. In order to be able to do that, we did a canonical correlation analysis. It sounds very sophisticated, I have to admit. And I can only talk about a few things, but which I would like to highlight here. The little dots that are connected are the forest ecosystem services, and I wanted to bring them out in the slide so that you can look at them a little more. So, Georg, could you please press yes? Okay. With regards to the socio-demographic factors, it clearly showed that the age, the relationship to forest, and also the rurality makes a difference for how respondents perceive wood production employment. But for the age class, there's also a strong relationship to hazard protection. Then if we look at gender, no, sorry, it's too fast. Then we look at gender, gender and recreation. Gender shows to be the strongest strongest predictor for recreation. And personal values such as self-transcendence, when you want to do the best for the society, has a strong, the strongest predictor is hazard protection and the mitigation of climate change. While conservation, like when people are very conservative, has a strong relationship with the effect of employment. So, Georg, could you please press yes? Thank you. For the environmental orientation, personal values, it clearly shows that the environmental orientation that people hold are a strong predictor for forest ecosystem services. But especially in the fact that the environmental orientation says something about the personal values, and women, for instance, that they have a strong relation, or let me say, between the preference of female respondents to preservation of plants and animals or access to knowledge and recreation shows clearly here. So if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, I think these four examples we have discussed to a certain extent. I would just like to emphasize on the relationship to forest. Those respondents that had a relationship to forest also showed a strong preference for wood production and, for instance, employment or fuel production. Next slide, please. So to sum up, what our study shows is that environmental personal values matter in relation to forest ecosystem services. For instance, female respondents with a very high environmental orientation and self-transcendence, so they want the best for the society, are more related to forest ecosystem services like climate change mitigation or preservation of plants and animals, while older, more conservative respondents living in rural areas with a direct relationship to forest, they show a preference for the factors of wood production, fuel production, hazard protection, and employment. While urban citizens more open to change, they show a preference to recreation, access to knowledge, products other than wood, and the preservation of plants and animals. To a certain extent, we knew that already, but we were not knowing how far environmental and personal values matter to forest ecosystem services. Next slide, please. It's Georg, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you, Helge. Now over to the second part of the presentation. Now I can't see this myself because there's this thing over here. I put this away. What is the importance of policy for forest ecosystem services provision and innovation? Well, obviously policies matters. That's why we also present on it. So the institutional framework enables and both prevents forest ecosystem services innovation, because it is crucially important who has assigned the rights. And that was also mentioned, I think, in the presentation entirely by Sven, to provide, or to who owns forest ecosystems, so to say. There are also obviously conflicting demands and interests among stakeholders. And in the survey that Marco has been introducing earlier this afternoon, conflicting demands and interest among stakeholders has been scoring very prominently as a preventing factor for ecosystem service related innovations. Just to show you this, this is again our landowners, forest owners and forest managers survey. And I'm only showing here the factors that were seen as inhibiting the most economically important and most innovative forest ecosystem service innovations in European forests. And what is striking from a perspective of policy making is that policymakers and stakeholders, as well as regulatory framework and laws and rules, were seen as rather inhibiting and as among the three most inhibiting factors for forest ecosystem services related innovations. So obviously there's need to talk about policy, we need to talk about politics. If you look a bit closer, and this is now partly based on the interviews we have been doing in the Sincere project at the EU level, but also in collaboration with Helge back then at the level of several member states. Policy trade-offs are unavoidable because you have different interests towards forest and underlying diversity of worldviews as well as societal demands. At the EU level, we observed in the interviews, as already in previous work, a major dichotomy, let's call it very easy, biodiversity versus bioeconomy, with climate mitigation adaptation being in between. To illustrate this a bit further, in this table you see two, let's say, poles in the policy discussion at the EU level. One is what we labeled the forestry and timber perspective, and the other one is what we labeled the nature conservation perspective. And they both were different with regard to key dimensions, that is, what is the view of forest, what are major policy goals, what is the resource management paradigm, and who are the actors that are prominently advocating for them. To begin, on the forestry and timber side, forests are mostly seen as a resource to be used sustainably. Competitiveness and innovation of the forest sector are central. Sustainable forest management is the key paradigm. Support for forest owners and producers, market governance, also incentives to perhaps diversify are important here. And this perspective is prominent amongst part of the Commission interviews. Also what we call forest-rich member states, Finland, Austria, and Sweden here mentioned, and forestry departments, and of course also forestry groups. Secondly, on the other side of a spectrum of different perspectives in between also, I should say, there's what you can label a nature conservation perspective. Here, forests are seen as ecosystems with irreplaceable biodiversity to be conserved. The major policy goal is then to increase or keep the biodiversity naturalness of forests. Conservation closer to nature forestry are resource management paradigms. The main policy goals are to conserve forests. Regulation is quite preferred, but also incentives. And this is shared, for instance, by DG Environment interviewees, also representatives of rather urbanized EU member state countries, and obviously environmental group and environmental departments. Why does this now matter for our issue of policies to incentivize forest ecosystem services? Well, there are some consequences. First of all, there is, and I think this is important to acknowledge, a quite fundamental disagreement among the main policy goals for forests in Europe. And related to that, there's also disagreements of who actually has the rights about forest ecosystem service. Are there more amongst the owners to be located amongst forest owners and landowners, or more along society? This is touching upon this public goods, private goods debate we had. And for there's, however, in the interviews quite obviously quite a lot of support for this idea, for having a payment for ecosystem service, to think about incentive mechanisms. But if you look closer, there are also mutual reservations. For instance, and this is quite indicative, regarding the major objectives or thresholds for funding, incentivizing ecosystem services provision. Is the right more with the owners? Where should funding, where should incentives start? Where should regulation end? And also the objectives, for instance, on the environmental side, more preference, especially for biodiversity conservation. On the side more of the forest sector, more preference also for more active management related, for instance, to climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Secondly, there are reservations on both sides from the interviewees relating to the durability of funding and also its redirecting effects. To make it easy, on the environmental side, interviewees are concerned that funding is nothing that will be permanent. You have perhaps an incentive for a landowner to work in his forests towards biodiversity for 5 or 10 years, but what is then happening afterwards? Similar concerns are coming from a forest sector perspective, where there is also the feeling, well, to reorient management towards, for instance, payment systems. How durable is this? Will it change the portfolio of my forest? And what's going to happen if in 5 or 10 years these incentives are disappearing? Thirdly, there's also a kind of disagreement about the question where funding and resources should come from. Basically, the money needs to come from somewhere, so to put. And if it's, for instance, taken from the common agricultural policy, there's less money available for other purposes if it would go into ecosystem or environmental services. And at the same time, also, if it would come more from the environmental side, it would mean basically transferring money from the environmental sector towards the landowners or the forest sector. So this is very indicative, but it illustrates a bit, let's say, the politics of talking about the things we have heard a lot upon in the afternoon, payment for environmental services system in the debate. Finally,
2 minutes, please, Gail.
Okay, 2 minutes. That's very good. We don't have time to go at the member state level, but we all know that there's a great diversity of forest policy and management objectives and traditions that makes it, of course, much more complicated to discuss this at the EU level. My last slide, and I think I hand over to Helga.
So we are ready at the conclusions. What could be concluded? Overall, we said that ecosystem service supply and demand have to match. That is clear, otherwise it will be difficult.
Then we think that at the EU level, there is a need to have something like a holistic EU policy level framework that acknowledges the importance of the diversity of forest ecosystem services, also looking at the results of public opinion surveys, but to be also explicit about this, let's say, multifunctionality. And secondly, there's also perhaps the necessity to promote a real dialogue between these two perspectives that we have been introducing, to jointly agree on where might be mirroring the planetary boundary discussions, there might be European boundaries for forest ecosystem provision within the EU.
Then on a member states or level or regional level, jointly agree on transparent FES priority setting could also be an interesting way to go.
And then next to final, there's also a clear need for policy integration and to have a thorough and honest discussion about where should resources or financial resources come from that are put together with the ambitious environmental goals that new EU policies have been establishing. So we have to talk here about policy integration. And I think your poll that you just launched is very interesting here, because a lot of the resources come from the CAP. A lot of the objectives are set in environmental policy right now in forest.
Last but not least, the diversification of communication is important, because as we have been arguing, there is not just one citizen, but different citizens can be reached only in different ways, to cut it short here. And with this, we are
awesome.
at the last slide.
Yes, we have arrived at the end, and I think we met the 2 minutes, right, Joe?
Yeah. Just over. So thank you very much, Georg and Helga. Just so, I mean, I just feel like I'm dealing with this on a daily basis at the moment. Anybody who's involved in forest policy is recognising that dichotomy, and it feels like it's getting worse. Anyway, sorry, neutral chair here. So I will now then pass over. Thank you very much, Georg and Helga. We're now going to talk about the all-important, really important topic of stakeholder engagement and participation. And for this, we're going to hear from Mireia Pecurel, who is from the Forest Science and Technology Centre of Catalonia, and Irina Prokofieva, who is also from the same institution. So do we have Mireia and Irina ready to go?
Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot, Joe. I'm going to present on behalf of both myself and Irina. And we have prepared a presentation just to illustrate how we can deal with stakeholder engagement and participation in this type of research we are doing concerning forest ecosystem services. And to do that, we are going to provide insights for both sincere and novel projects that both of us we are involved in. Also, just to show how the presentation is going to be structured. First, we are going to talk a bit about what is the need for this engagement, as I think it goes very well with the previous presentation. We end up with a clear need for dialogue and transparency on how to make decisions, how to introduce people's views in decision-making processes, and that's also on the core of this engagement with stakeholders. I would like to then move into how to do that. So from the justification on providing examples and how you can engage with stakeholders in these research projects. And then focusing with experience of sincere and based on results we have from evaluation we just undertook with the participants of the project. We are going to analyze more in details whom to select and how different processes are happening in how to engage and what are the challenges and what are the enabler structures to overcome those challenges. And finally, we are going to talk a bit about the impact, and we are going to draw some conclusions or lessons learned. Well, the justification for engagement with stakeholders, I think it's very important to see that the European Commission is putting a lot of emphasis, and it's a big driver since a lot of the budget of the biggest research funds are also based on how you do this stakeholder engagement. And the idea, I think, from behind this, it's that the outcomes of these research projects have to be demand driven. And the idea is that to ensure the sustainability in the future when the project ends. So like there is a sense of ownership. So like it's not only about the scientific brains, but also to bring in other important skills as the local knowledge or entrepreneur skills that stakeholders might have. So it's a change of paradigm. So from a research perspective, it's not the stakeholders as an object of research, but also as a part of this research. And I think also the final end is to accept to increase the acceptability and the scaling up of the results and the outcomes of these projects. From a researcher's point of view, and that it's also taken from Sinclair's and Nobel's projects, I think the research interest for engaging with stakeholders, in this case, it's to have this coordination system of forest ecosystem services, and these projects have been designed to bring across actors from different policy levels and different sectors. And I think that's important to make this kind of policy recommendations. And especially since Sinclair has put a lot of emphasis on making a project where co-learning is facilitated. So there is a learning architecture, and stakeholders are there not to pick one brain, but to pick all brains to produce knowledge that can be transferred in all cases. In the case of Nobel, I think also the point of bringing together different stakeholders was to ensure from the beginning that it's going to be this demand-driven partnership. So a lot of effort has been done at the beginning to try to see who will demand these services and who is going to provide, and try to match this relation in the business model from the beginning. And finally, of course, I think from a social research perspective, these processes are very interesting just to dig deeper and analyze the institutional settings and the actors from a local perspective, since the context also influence a lot the type of innovation action you can really make. And then finally, from the perspective of the stakeholders themselves, that it's taken also from evaluation forms. I think mainly we can see that there are three big issues here, and one is to increase this participation and even attempt a bit of a conflict resolution between different extreme positions. Also, there is a more pragmatic way to go forward and try to ease the implementation of subsidies or incentives that helps for forest management. And finally, I think also there is a lot of insights that justify these projects trying to broaden this knowledge about ecosystem services and educate the people that you bring in along the whole project. So, and how to engage with stakeholders. I'm starting just to state that there are many different types of engagement you can do, and from a simple informing people about the project and keeping them updated, to empower people and really put the research into the services of what citizens wants to do. So there is a broad spectrum. And I think I will say that you have to choose whatever fills the purpose of your objective. It's not that something is better or it's worse. It depends on the objective you have. And in the case of methodologies using Sinclair and Nobel, we have touching in this broader spectrum. I think we have done in both projects a lot of work in surveying what are these demands, what are these suppliers, what they expect, what are their individual preferences from different forest ecosystem services. I think also in Nobel has been done a lot of work in trying to involve people or consult people on how these actions should be done, and to try to engage them in the whole rule setting of these auctions. And in the case of Sinclair, I think the methods used, they lean more into the collaborative scale of implication, since they have really involved people in the co-design of these innovation actions. And they have also involved several people and experts in these cross-fertilization activities to learn from each case. And they have also engaged multi-actor groups in securing the implementation of these innovation actions. So I'm gonna now focusing more on the sincere results from the engagement. And I think the first thing you need to plan when you want to engage stakeholders is to decide who you are gonna engage with. And therefore there are some techniques, and it's called the stakeholder engagement or stakeholder analysis. And I think this project has brought a structure on criteria, who to select. And as you see on the upper bit of the slide, there are different criteria. So gender balance, age balance, private public sector balance, different nationalities, different disciplines, different opinions, power balance. And from the cases, you can see that the thing that was considered more important was to have this diversity opinions, followed by balance between private and public sector balance. And that is in a way reflected on the type of actors that has been really severely involved in the innovation action, which is mainly forest land owners, followed by public entities that in a way they are interested as providers of these forest ecosystem services. I think final end users and private companies are also important, as they are the intermediates or the recipients of these services, and they have been involved, but it's clear that in a minor way than the providers. Then it's also we ask how difficult it was to involve people, and if people kept the interest along the process. And both graphs shows that it was relatively positive. So like over 50% or in some cases 70% were involved from the beginning. And then also they kept the interest through the whole process. I think that it's also very important, especially in participation processes, where you can also lose people from fatigue and nothing happens. And I think the way to keep this interest is also related with the type of engagement you provide. And in an innovation action, as in almost all the policy process, you have different phases. So like the agenda setting, the implementation, the communication. And you can see here that people was quite satisfied with the involvement on all these different phases. I will not go into detail, but maybe just to point out that the things that people were not so convinced that they were really involved in was to do or to create this co-ownership that was intended from the beginning. And as you remember, that it's one of the priority also from the European Commission. So that was not fully consensus on that, that was achieved. And then also another critical issue here is that it was considered the existing forest ecosystem services, demand and supply. And as you see, I saw also the previous slide, we could see also our underrepresentation maybe from the demand side. So that can be also interesting. So in the process, then of course, you face a lot of challenges. And I think basically the three most recurrent ones were conflicts, or how to manage these conflicts about stakeholders and how to deal with these different opinions. Also, it was mentioned many times, these communication difficulties, because people has different degrees of knowledge about the topic, about the context, about people coming from urban cities, from people coming from rural cities. They sometimes speak a different language. And how to organize these meetings and this exchange of information. And finally, especially when we discussed special business models, so how to go from an individual case to something that interests the broader public and everyone that was involved. And some of the enable structures that these processes facilitated was the importance of this someone or the coordination of the project or an external mediator that regulate all these dialogues. Also the fact that it was organizing sessions that they were tailored specifically for some needs from some participants. And it was also very relevant that sometimes also the informal meetings were also very crucial for the development of the project. So in this sense, I think it's important to provide opportunities, formal and informal, for everyone to join. In terms of information exchange, I think it was mentioned many times that it was important that everyone or information was available in front of the sessions, and also it was really well appreciated the input from some experts in the project. And finally, about this in how to go from an individual to a general interest, it was important to find enough ground for this scaling up and this generalization. So it's also important for the whole region and not only for one business. Okay, and I'm now also going to kind of an end. I think the benefits, if you really group or try to group them in three main blocks, I think the participants all appreciated that the one benefit was to strengthen this plurality, and the process itself was seen as added value, and also even the recognition that this plurality bring for the recognition that different forest ecosystem services, they have also different values for different people. Also, I think a big block, it's this increasing the stakeholder skills and capability. So like how to organize these processes, how to communicate what are the importance of these forest ecosystem services, even the concepts themselves. I think the Russian case was especially emphasizing that their public authorities and public officials are not at all familiar with these concepts. So for them was breaking ground that they had to start from the beginning. And finally, I think also it brought or improved the stakeholder interaction and resources. So most of them now, they have toolkits to do things. They know about other best practices, so that in a way builds confidence and trust that they can do something similar in their own countries. And then also they build networks they can rely upon. So final remarks and lessons learned, it's, well, that shows that it's possible to bridge between science and practice. Involving different actors helps to understand differences in values, beliefs, and attitudes. And the more you make people shaping the innovation, the more engagement you have from the public you engage. Conflicts can be solved during the project. And I think also it was clear that the local contextual level, it's important since one size don't fit all. So that means that each case has their own formal and informal rules, property rights, culture, and that has to be taken into account to really make the innovation happen. Context, nevertheless, can be influences as well for these processes. I think there is also very big cultural differences between, for instance, Denmark and Russia in terms of participatory culture. So, and that is also a challenge for the researchers themselves, because the research itself doesn't fit all, isn't it? So how to adapt these processes to these local governance settings that are so different. And here again, it's more a matter of reflection. It's not really a learning, but when we talk about co-creation and co-learning, so how to build a process that is flexible enough to bring all these differences, and at the same time how to co-build with these actors the framework that they have to operate, the rule of the games, the constraints that they will have to face when they are designing their own innovation actions. So, and yeah, so with that reflection, I will conclude, and I hope that we have an interesting discussion later. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Maria. That's fascinating. And this whole different participatory cultures, but still having meaningful conversations. It's just so real. See it all the time, and just need to be so nimble in terms of nipping between how to change your approach depending on the culture that you're operating in. So yeah, I really recognise that. Okay, so thanks very much for that.